A couple of months ago, Science Internet debated the controversial YouTube video by the physicist and science communicator Sabine Hossenfelder. The reason is straightforward. A big red text stating "academia is communism" in the thumbnail, and claims like "academia is a planned economy" and "we finance it the same way that the communists financed their production chains" in the video itself. Lots of controversial takes to talk about. And while I have no interest to debate the topic of whether Sabine is irresponsible in her potentially fear-mongering rhetoric, the question whether academia is communist does make some sense, though maybe not in the way most people expect it to. The communist norm in academia has nothing to do with communism as a financial system, but there might be a fair point to labeling good science as being communist, and that's what we'll talk about today. The first sense in which academia could be communist is how it is financed, and that is what Sabine is alluding to. She makes the comparison of planned economy and 5-year plans in science. What she is referring to with this analogy is how many publicly funded research projects nowadays get their money. We can basically distinguish two forms of how public science gets its money. First, you could be a professor with indefinite contract at a university, and you could get your salary for doing research and maybe a bit extra money for lab equipment, running studies, and so on. You get the same money every year, and that's how you do your research. But others, especially those who are not full professors with permanent contracts, are funded by grants that run for a couple of years only. These grants pay your salary and give you money for research expenses. These might be the communist 5-year plans that Sabine is referring to. According to some data I could find, more than half of scientists still work via the first financing scheme, not the latter, project-based funding. If that is correct, most science certainly isn't funded through communist 5-year plans. Sabine also has objections to the regular research that full professors do, especially in physics, but that is a topic for another video. With regards to funding public scientific research through time-limited grants, we should ask two questions. First, is that system broken? And second, does private science do it better? As to the first, if you'd ask scientists working at universities, you're almost guaranteed to hear criticism of the way these grants are funded and given out. But interestingly, not for the reasons that Sabine mentions. Scientists that I have spoken to and that you can read from online are annoyed by how much time they have to spend on writing research proposals for grants rather than doing the actual research itself. Also, at a certain point, the decision procedure over which projects are funded can be quite arbitrary. Not because people don't know how to evaluate projects, but because if you check hundreds of projects and only have limited money, the last round of contestants will likely all be good enough to be financed. Therefore, there are actually some researchers who have defended the idea that in these last rounds of decisions, we should simply opt for a lottery. Remember that these grant proposals have to be peer-reviewed by academics, and that takes time. Time that they could have spent on their own research. So it might just be more productive to simply randomize who gets the funds for the last round of projects. Sabine is of course worried about DEI and wokeness deciding who gets the money, but I have seen no good evidence that projects are not in principle mainly evaluated on their merit. Sure, all else equal, you might prefer a project that has impact on DEI, and people typically have to make DEI statements, but these can be more of a formality. Scientists would like to spend less time on writing and reviewing grant applications, but they don't think that the system of funding these projects is fundamentally broken. You need a way to know which projects to put money in when you have limited resources, and peer review is one way to do that. How else would you have people decide on what to fund? Would private funding work better? Sabine thinks so, because all of the groupthink and DEI in public academia is terrible. Now, I do not know why we would expect more groupthink in public science rather than private science, but let's ignore that for now. Here are some reasons for why you might expect private funding to not work any better or even much differently than public funding. Private funding is looking for ROI, return on investment, and basic research, which is what universities are doing, is not the best way to put money in for that. And it is also not true that private funding does not have the same institutional constraints. Investors are beholden to their stakeholders and funders, so they can't work indefinitely without providing results at some point. And other incentives are even worse. Just think of all the fake studies that are being commissioned by big companies. There has been fraud in science in public academia as well, but there is no principled reason to think that this would not happen in private research. For a good idea of where and how to allocate your money, you probably also need some form of peer review process. How else do you find out where to put your money, but by asking the experts in the field where they see the biggest opportunities? And to the 5-year plans, research projects in private industry will be cancelled once they turn out not to be profitable. Sure, you might not have a set year plan as with public grant money, but that doesn't mean that the resource allocation isn't centrally planned somewhere, likely by stakeholders of the resources. And then there's research that private companies likely won't fund. Maybe much of the research that is being done in the humanities. Now, you can make the argument that this is a good thing. Here we come to a value judgment that is difficult to solve. Universities used to adhere to the Humboldt principle, which saw universities as places not where you simply get a diploma, but where you are being educated as a whole, so to speak. That involves art, science, culture, and so on. While I won't make a case for that ideal here, this is something to keep in mind when thinking about the funding argument. Okay, so I'm a bit skeptical that Sabine's arguments against public funding of science based on the communist 5-year plan has much weight. First, I think that private funding might have a similar structural problem where they need to go through referees and peer review systems and where they are beholden to stakeholders who will cut your funding if things don't work out in the short term. Second, the problems that Sabine is pointing to can still be reformed. Academics that are being funded by public money agree that reform is necessary. So why not change the rhetoric from should we defund academia to should we improve academic funding? From the arguments she presents, I cannot see a case for abolition rather than reform. A response to a comment in her YouTube video actually leads us to a second way in which public research can be considered communist. A commenter asks whether private research funding would mean that research results won't be made public, and whether this is a fundamental problem. And it is a problem because science ought to be widely available and public for it to be science in the first place. More on that later. Sabine's response to that has 3 directions. First, we can force them not to do that. So we can force private companies to make research results public. Second, even if that is so, private research might still lead to more scientific results. Third, there are companies that try to figure out what people found out based on their patents or technology that they published. In my view, this is a rather poor response. First, sure, the government can try to regulate private investments and make it so that they have to share their research. But the question is whether private companies would then still invest as much in research if the results would have to be made available to everyone. If the market were to have an interest in that, why hasn't it happened yet? Second, yes, maybe competition will still enable scientific progress, but the very point of Sabine's critique is that publicly funded science is not as productive as it can be, and that would then also be true of privately funded science that is kept secret. Scientific research lives from sharing data, methods and results, which by definition would not be possible unless they are made public. As to the third point, you may try to re-engineer the results from patents or technology, but that at the very least stifles the progress and makes it much more slower than it could be. It seems like a waste of resources to have Team A make a scientific discovery and then have Team B try to painstakingly re-engineer that discovery from the technological outputs from Team A, if that is even possible at all for most research projects. As Sabine emphasizes, she thinks that these problems to the public nature of private research are solvable. Maybe, but why not extend the same optimism to the problems of publicly funded research? Here, I cannot really guess why optimism goes one way but not the other. But let me come back to the idea that science has to make research public. Here, philosophers and scientists have defended the idea that science indeed ought to be communist. Now, don't be afraid, this is not to say that all professors should be communist. Rather, this argument is about the values in the practice of science. Specifically, a recent paper made the argument that what distinguishes science as a practice is the communist norm. And this norm states that research ought to be accessible to everyone and everywhere. Science depends on everyone being able to access the research, to criticize it, to transform it, and so on. Bright and Heeson make the argument that this actually demarcates science from other research practices. Now, you might think that obviously what science is about is gaining insight. And that's certainly a central point of the practice. But think about this thought experiment. Imagine a researcher that is hidden away in his shed, doing all sorts of experiments, unmasking the secrets of nature. But they never write anything down to pass on. They never get in contact with colleagues, they don't partake in scientific exchange. Would you call this person a scientist, in the evaluative sense of the term? Bright and Heeson suggest that this would be inadequate. And here's where publicly funded research seems to fare better than privately funded research. Many companies actively try to prevent their research from coming to light before they can sell it. And even then, they try to keep it secret as long as possible, so that others cannot replicate it. Or they buy patents which other researchers would at least have to spend a lot of money to continue to add to the research. Again, none of this is to say that privately funded research is bad. In principle, I'm happy for every dollar that goes into scientific research. But the attack on publicly funded science, based on its communist norm, not only appears to miss the point, but actively gets wrong what is valuable about the scientific enterprise. It is a community of nerds trying to figure out stuff together. Well, of course, that is the ideal. Actual publicly funded science is also to a large extent a status game. You want to publish to be the best in the game, not necessarily to improve our understanding of the universe, or at least not only for that reason. Also, not every research output is easily accessible. Journals, publishers, and paywalls are a whole other topic to discuss. But in principle, publicly funded science is adhering to the communist norm, and people are trying to align practice more to these values. This is of course not easy in the current political climates over much of the world. And dare I say, I think some science communicators might also do more harm than good in that regard. So, is academia communist? If by that you mean centrally funded and committing to sharing, then yes, by design. But that's a good thing. It's precisely why science works. We should improve how we plan and reward public research, but simply pointing to private research does not seem to solve these problems, as privately funded research also has to go through similar hoops and might even introduce a bunch of new problems, as I wanted to show in this video. Also, the planned economy argument only applies to public research that is funded through external grants. Sure, in general you can have worries that there is, as Sabine thinks, groupthink in science. But if that is so, we should also expect it to exist in private science. The best way to approach things is to improve both, not tear down one and not the other. Let me clarify that I don't want to make the argument that there should be no private research. In principle, I would say that the more money goes into research, the better. The question in this video was only whether publicly funded research is communist, and if it is, whether it is a bad thing. And I tried to convince you that it is not a bad thing. I hope to read some of your thoughts in the comments of this video. Thanks for watching.